Hi, this is Dr. Burton. I'm back, and I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by Nietzschean epistemology. In the last video, I gave a little argument at the end where I said critical theory assumes Nietzschean epistemology, and there's no common ground with Nietzschean epistemology, so there's no common ground with critical theory. But I didn't really define Nietzschean epistemology. And I want to talk about this a little bit. So we've talked about critical theory as a system, as a philosophy. Epistemology is the part of a system of philosophy that addresses questions about knowledge. How do we know? And in my work, I have focused on epistemology. It's my area of study. And in my book, I focused on post-Nietzschean epistemology after Nietzsche. And I want to give you a sense of what that is, because if you start reading books in critical theory, you will start to see this show up. So maybe not all of it, but you will start to see it. And some of this is mixed in with metaphysics, what is real, because you really can't separate them. I mean, you can try. So what is Nietzschean epistemology like? I'm going to say it begins with the assumption that reason is not ontological. Reason does not apply to being. And this is the exact opposite of what has gone on in the history of philosophy from, let's say, Plato to Nietzsche. Plato was maybe around 400, 390 before Common Era to Nietzsche dies in 1900. There's a long history of philosophy where reason is ontological. Reason applies to being. Now, when reason doesn't apply to being, that means we can't know being. Being is what exists. All we know of existence is through our experience, and our experience tells us existence is flux. It's constant motion and change. Nothing is permanent. And if nothing is permanent, there is no objective reality. And if there's no objective reality, then there's no objective meaning to words. There is no truth. Truth is what is real. If there's no real, except for this process of flux, and he thinks it's forces coming up against each other and people coming up against each other, there's no objective truth in terms of metaphysics and ethics. And if you look at post-Nietzschean philosophy, they explicitly reject that we could know anything about reality or the good life in an objective sense. So there's no knowledge. Knowledge has to do with things that are sure, certain. There's no certainty. There's skepticism. Nobody can really have certainty. And if that's the case, then we get to this position of perspectivalism. All we have is our own perspective. And we are the authority of our own perspective. So only you know what you perceive. So you are the authority of your life. This gets us to the question of authority. Now, I talk about reason is authoritative. It's the highest authority, and it cannot be questioned, but it makes questioning possible. Because post-Nietzschean philosophy rejects reason, they reject the authority of reason. So any kind of authority, particularly in ourself and in the institutions of culture, is going to be based on the will to power. So we have our personal perspective, so we're the authority of ourselves. But there are groups that also have particular experiences for that group, and they are the authority on the group experience. and there is a power struggle. This is maybe adding some Marx in with Nietzsche between those groups. Human nature is not fundamentally rational for Nietzsche and the post-Nietzschean philosophers. We're not rational beings. We don't have a soul for sure. We're biological beings. Perhaps we're animals. I don't even know if we're more advanced animals anymore. We're the animals that bring harm on the earth, so maybe we're bad animals. But we are, either our will is central or our emotions are central. I have a hard time, I think it differs for different thinkers. I have a hard time nailing that one down, but maybe they go together. Maybe our emotions serve our will, or maybe our will serves our emotion. Maybe we're like, I want this thing. I don't have this thing. I will use my emotions to get that thing. Emotions become a kind of power. All right. I just thought of how I sometimes hear it. Logic is male, emotions are female, and then when you get into feminism, you have standpoint epistemology, and women know in a way that men don't know because they have had the experience of being a woman. And then you could use that as a source of struggle with the oppressor. All right, so we do need to get into some metaphysics with the post-Nietzschean philosophers. God is dead. God is dead for Nietzsche, meaning God is not culturally relevant. We don't bring God into the story. God isn't part of the story of how we imagine ourselves. We're the authority now. We are our own gods. He literally says that. We have become gods. We have to determine what is good and evil for ourselves. So we've displaced God. Now we are gods, and we have the responsibility now of being the God of our life. And that's a burden. So we become like God, determining good and evil for ourselves. We are the ultimate authority, and we're also the ultimate bearers of responsibility. Now, I've talked about this in the worldview discussion when we talked about the philosophy of critical theory, but the post-Nietzschean philosophers are also going to talk about a collective will to power. Now, I kind of understand why they went this way. If you have an individual will to power, which is what Nietzsche would have preferred, the individual, the Superman, that would become a war of each person against all, which is what Hobbes, a philosopher, was trying to make the social contract against, so we don't kill each other. So there's this, in the modern period of philosophy, a collective will where we kind of agree with each other for the sake of society to give up some of our liberty, some of our power to join a collective. And so there is in critical theory a definite collective view. And there's a collective will to power that's seen. It's groups based on identity, and identity could be race, class, gender, and they are opposed to those are minority groups opposed to the majority. So there's an oppressor group and oppressed groups, and they are in a power struggle. And that's a little bit of Marx. You can call this cultural Marxism, which is what critical theory developed. The philosophers took Marx and his economic theory and added another philosopher named Gramsci, and he gave the cultural aspect so that we don't have to look at oppressor and oppressed groups as only economic, but they could be based on identity like race or gender. And the evidence that there is this power struggle is by looking at the inequalities in society. Inequity is how we hear it. And so we want equity, which means some group has to give up some of its power for the other group. So there is a power struggle. This comes directly from Nietzsche with a bit of added stuff from Marx and Gramsci. And the last piece of the Nietzschean epistemology that I want to talk about is the language game, or language is a fiction. Actually, what Nietzsche says is reason is a fiction, the laws of thought are a fiction, truth is a fiction, and it was made by the philosophers to impose order on the chaos that is this world. So think of it this way. Everything is in flux. Myself is in that flux and flow, and humans need order. We need to make sense of things. And so we create stories to impose on the world to give it order. And these stories have sometimes been understood as a language game, a meta-narrative, a grand narrative. But Nietzsche talks about it as a fiction. Language is a fiction. And we forget, okay, philosophers made up this story. We forgot it was made up. We think it's true and real. And then we live by the rules. And the rules themselves oppress us. So you might see in critical theory this desire to throw off rules that oppress, like mathematics and science and the scientific method and reason. These rules are made up by us. That's why they're oppressive. We made up these silly rules that keep us from being our full selves, so we need to be liberated from the rules, rather than recognizing, no, there are actually rules to reality. So language is a fiction, or there's a game, a language game, and even those games are in tension with each other for power. For a long time, science was the dominant language game. Now critical theory is the dominant language game, and critical theory is showing up science. You guys claim to be objective, but really you are just another grand meta-narrative, and you're oppressing people with your rules. So there are probably other things we could say, but let's wrap this up, the epistemology. I think I've gotten some of the major pieces that you should look for. Reason does not apply to being. Meaning is not objective. There is no truth that is objective. There is no knowledge that is possible. It's a skeptical view. Truth is based on perspective, perspectivalism. It's true for me. My truth. Speak your truth. That's perspectivalism. There's no ultimate authority outside of the individual or the group. Perhaps the group is the authority. And human nature is not fundamentally rational. It's emotional and will. God is dead. There's no metaphysical referent. There's no transcendent reality. There's no soul. The will to power is a collective will to power. There's a power struggle, the oppressor and the oppressed. And language is a fiction. It's a game. And it's the game of the oppressor and the oppressed. So language itself is bound up in this battle. And so you will see these things in running as a theme throughout critical theory. Sometimes it's called standpoint epistemology. It's my perspective as true. So they're not going to say, no, there's no truth. But truth is based on the game you're playing and your perspective. Truth is not something we share in terms of an objective standard that's outside of ourself. Now, can logic help us to work through these ideas? I think so. And I think my series on retrieving reason was a really long discussion of how to do that. But if that didn't work, I will remind you in small ways. So, the epistemology of critical theory. Let's just see if we can take it from here and critically analyze this epistemology. All right. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.